Good evening and welcome to Turner Classic Movies. I'm Dave Karger. In commemoration of Veterans Day this weekend, we are partnering tonight with the American Red Cross for an evening of films about Red Cross workers serving during wartime. And our special guest tonight is Dr. Michael Jordan. Dr. Jordan is the Vice President of Service to the Armed Forces at the American Red Cross. Dr. Jordan, thanks so much for being here.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
The first movie that we're talking about is from 1943, So Proudly We Hail, and it's a movie about a group of American Red Cross nurses serving in the Philippines in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. So we have Claudette Colbert, Paulette Goddard, and Veronica Lake. What were your impressions of this movie when you took a look at it?
Well, a couple things. First, when I think about the Red Cross and the work they did in standing up the Red Cross services, nursing services, they have just a proud history and tradition dating back to the early days of the Red Cross. And it was actually a lady by the name of Jane Delano, who was an Army officer who left the Army as a nurse and started the Red Cross nursing services. But when I reflect on the movie and seeing the nurses and what they were doing, it was actually pretty emotional. Having been in a combat zone as a Marine, I served in the Marine Corps in Operation Iraqi Freedom and in Operation Desert Storm, but the subtleties that they picked up in that movie were pretty amazing. There was a scene when they're on the ship trying to celebrate the Christmas holidays and get in the Christmas spirit, but they had just picked up a set of survivors from a ship that had been attacked, and those folks were processing and struggling through the trauma that they had just gone through. And so to try to suppress the trauma, try to engage and enjoy the festivities of that evening and then go right back to the being in the war, that kind of moved me because I know how that feels. And a lot of those folks had to suppress their emotions and get back to work.
Right.
They didn't have much time to sit there and really process the trauma that they just experienced. And, over time that accumulates. But that's what I noticed, and I thought that was very real, the depiction of you just experienced this, now get over it and move on.
When I was watching this, I really took notice of the importance of camaraderie and morale. And in the midst of traumatic experiences, that's what these women were able to present and keep alive. Is that something that you find is important as well?
Well, I do. And I think given the intensity of the context of where they're at, it kind of creates that camaraderie where everybody's taking care of one another. And, based on what you learn in this movie, the team that you're with today may not be the same team tomorrow.
So, of course, this is decades after the founding of the American Red Cross. We all think of Clara Barton, and that was in the late 19th century. When you think back to the American Red Cross and what their most important duties were during World War II, what kind of comes to mind?
Two things. Of course, Jane Delano founding the American Red Cross services in 1909, and it was really her vision was to stand up a reserve of qualified and pre-certified nurses so that in the event that there was a war or a natural disaster. So fast forward to World War II. Between 1939 and 1946, when this movie had occurred, the American Red Cross Nurses Services grew to 200,000 young women who were trained and ready to deploy. And when you look across the time frame of 6 years, over 71,000 actually deployed to combat theaters around the globe and served the military. In fact, they made up 90% of the nurses that were deployed in the field supporting the Army Nurses Corps and the Navy Nurses Corps, along with the Red Cross.
All right, so let's take a look at the movie and then we'll talk more about it afterwards. From 1943, starring Claudette Colbert, Paulette Goddard, and Veronica Lake, here is So Proudly We Hail. And I'm back with Dr. Michael Jordan from the American Red Cross to talk a little bit more about So Proudly We Hail. Dr. Jordan, do you find this movie at all sanitized or idealized when it comes to the depiction of war, or do you think it's kind of accurately gritty?
Dave, I think from a thematic perspective, I think it's accurate. My experience in a war zone, both serving as a U.S. combat Marine in Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Desert Storm, the themes I thought were spot on. What was different was just the flash and bang and the high level of action and maybe what you might see visually. But they were powerful themes, and I don't mind saying that. Watching the themes got me choked up.
Wow. I was looking back at some reviews of this film, and a lot of the critics back in the 1940s took note and praised this film for its frank depictions of wartime. Also, this is a unique film because it does focus on a group of women. I don't think that's something that we see a lot in particularly the war films that we show here on TCM. Did it feel like a different film to you compared to other war films that you might have watched over the years?
Well, it did, because the older war movies generally depicted males in combat, and the women being in the rear and providing support. In this particular film, the women were right there in the mix fighting with the enemy. There was no front line. They were in the fight. And there is one particular scene which was very real, and actually I've experienced it myself in a war zone, but where the nurses were trying to treat the wounded. They had set up a medical facility the best they could to provide that care. They had set up makeshift ambulances to go out and find the wounded and bring them back. And then they were attacked. And those are violations of international humanitarian law, but they depicted that in this movie. These women were very much in the front lines.
I know you took particular note of a moment where Claudette Colbert's character receives a message from the George Reeves character. Why was that significant for you?
Well, it was significant to me for two reasons. One is, you know, the American Red Cross does respond to emergency situations for our troops deployed around the world, and we do it through the emergency communication message. And if somebody has lost a loved one, or somebody's become ill, or there's been a birth in the family, we can get that news to them anywhere around the globe and within 6 hours, and it keeps the family and the troop connected. Why it personally connected with me with that message was in my own deployment to Iraq. I remember first arriving in country, and my boss had gotten a message that his wife had become seriously ill at home, and he had to return home. And the Red Cross made that happen. And the Red Cross verifies the messages with medical people back in the U.S. so that the commanders in the field know that it's a verified message. And then donors and different relief societies for the military will then provide money for that trooper to get home.
So this movie came out 80 years ago. How would you say the American Red Cross differs now in the services that it provides versus what we just saw in this film?
Yeah, I think 80 years ago, we did stand up a nurses reserve corps of 200,000 young women who were certified and ready to deploy in the event of war or disaster. And in fact, we deployed 71,000 women between 1939 and 1946. Today, we continue with the global reach. I've got Red Crossers and volunteers deployed and stationed all around the globe. And this last year alone, I personally traveled to almost virtually every one of the 37 sites where we have our folks deployed to make sure that we're doing the work of keeping the troop connected with their family.
Well, I'm so glad, even more so now, after hearing that travel itinerary, that you were able to be with us today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Jordan, thank you so much. Will you stick around? We'll do one more movie.
I will.
Okay. Well, coming up next is another wartime drama from 1956 starring Deborah Carr and William Holden. Stay with us. Hi, I'm Dave Karger. Welcome back to Turner Classic Movies and more of our salute to the American Red Cross in commemoration of Veterans Day this weekend. Very happy to be back with Dr. Michael Jordan. Dr. Jordan is the Vice President of Service to the Armed Forces at the American Red Cross. Hello again.
Hello again, Dave.
So our second film tonight is from 1956. It's called The Proud and Profane, directed by George Seaton and starring Deborah Carr, William Holden, and Thelma Ritter. This is a really interesting movie because it combines war drama basically with soap opera. Deborah Carr plays a war widow who travels to an island in the South Pacific to serve for the American Red Cross, and she meets this gruff officer played by William Holden. What struck you about this movie? Did those two genres fit together for you, the war movie and the soap opera?
I think they did, because in my own experience, being forward deployed in Operation Iraqi Freedom or Operation Desert Storm, you do have both. And I've seen those characters in real life. And so I thought William Holden did an exceptional job of playing the hardened Marine colonel and commander. And in fact, I know that he wanted to actually avoid spending any time with the Red Cross because he wanted to keep his men hardened and focused on the fight. And I think what he was probably missing, and what comes out, I think, in the theme is that there is the humanity side of the work. And you've got to have that time where you have time with the chaplain, also time spending with the women who were running the Red Cross services in support of the troops in allowing that interaction.
You know, before we talk about Deborah Carr and what she does in this film, her character, I want to kind of tee up one thing about the William Holden character. I don't want to say too much because I think a lot of people are going to be watching this movie for the first time tonight, but he's a tough character to watch at times. He plays it well, but there's some things that are not going to sit well, particularly with the contemporary audience, about how he behaves in this movie, and we can talk more about it afterwards. But in comparison to the movie we just watched, So Proudly We Hail, where the American Red Cross nurses were kind of on the front lines, Deborah Kerr's character here is more in a service club for the American Red Cross, and she's doing different things that open my eyes. She's dancing with the servicemen. She's giving them French lessons. She's playing chess. It's different from what we saw, but I'm assuming this is accurate and this was going on around the time, correct?
It is. This is accurate. In fact, at the height of World War II, based on the request from the U.S. government, the American Red Cross was asked to manage and set up nearly 2,000 clubs in the war theaters around the globe. And if they couldn't set up a club, they'd have a club mobile that would come out remotely to visit the troops and provide services.
Oh, that's so interesting. One thing that we talk about here on TCM a lot of the time is that the movies that came out during wartime, one of the things that they did, whether intentional or not, was really help morale back here at home. And I'm sure helped support organizations like the American Red Cross. How can people who are interested, who feel inspired by movies like this, support the American Red Cross today?
Well, the mission continues. When I look at the work we did in World War II, it was really based on I think the public sentiment, culture, and support of the Red Cross. That's why we were able to carry out our mission. And when I reflect in World War II, nearly every American family was touched by the Red Cross. Either they were a recipient of the services, like me as a combat veteran from Iraq or Desert Storm, having received the services of the Red Cross, or they back home on the home front, they were donating money, maybe they were donating their blood, or they were volunteering to do work like put together care packages. And when I reflect on my own experience, you would think receiving a care package is just something simple or nice, but when you're working outside the wire or deployed in the field and you don't have access to a shower, may not have access to hot meals, getting that Red Cross package, you're able to get hygiene items, which are pretty practical in that scenario. You're able to get food items to sustain you. And every one of them includes a letter from home, from somebody who says, hey, we're thinking about you. And there's a comment in the movie, and I don't want to be a spoiler, but there's one particular wounded Marine who mentions the fact that I can actually view a Red Cross person out here stationed in the war zone makes me feel like somebody gives a damn, quote unquote, in the movie.
There's a lot to be fascinated by in this movie, and we'll talk more about it after we watch it. Here's the film from 1956, starring Deborah Kerr and William Holden, The Proud and Profane. And I'm very happy to be back with Dr. Michael Jordan of the American Red Cross. And Dr. Jordan, I love William Holden, but this character is troubling to me. The physical abuse, the lying towards Deborah Kerr, and she as the woman is kind of asked to forgive him at the end. I'm not looking for anyone to excuse his behavior, but to try to explain it. Would you say that his character reflects the stresses and traumas of wartime, or is he just a shady guy?
Well, his character really dishonors himself and he breaches his integrity, and his treatment of his love interest is poor. But I have seen where, based on the trauma, they become very hardened and they lose their humanity. And when I watched that, I guess that's why it became a little bit emotional to me, because what I saw was a character who had really been damaged through being a war-hardened warfighter. And you heard that in the movie when he said, I've got to train Marines to get out and fight and kill the enemy. And that's their mission, to survive. And so it doesn't necessarily excuse the behavior, but I've seen it where some practically lose their humanity. In my own experience, I was able to spot the folks that I thought struggled with their humanity and then trying to find ways to bring it back. And how you bring it back is their interaction with some normalcy, like having interaction with the chaplain or going to the chapel service, or maybe, meeting Red Crossers who are civilians out there who kind of bring a touch of home. And in fact, back in World War II, through the wisdom of a lot of senior military leaders, they said one of the biggest things that the Red Cross provided then in this context was a touch of home to help that humanity. But that's what I saw in the movie, and it bothered me.
Yeah. Well, both of the films that we watched tonight were about American Red Cross workers working overseas. What about here domestically? You think about things like blood services or life-saving training courses or disaster relief. What are some priorities for the Red Cross here at home these days?
Yeah, currently we spend more and more time focused on climate crises. going on with the weather events that we've experienced that you've seen in the news. And we are deploying our teams all across the country to take care of the most underserved communities. And we rely on the generosity of donors financially, but also volunteers. Volunteers make up 90% of our organization, are out taking care of their fellow citizens during these climate crises. But we also provide the life-saving skills, really important, whether it's becoming swim qualified or if somebody has a cardiac arrest and trying to treat a heart attack, we provide that training. And then, of course, the all-important blood supply. The Red Cross represents over 40% of the blood supply in the United States. And so we have an obligation to continue to manage and maintain that blood supply and take care of Americans who are in need.
And given the fact that we are commemorating Veterans Day this weekend, I imagine Veterans Relief Services are something that's very important to you personally.
That's right. When I think about Veterans Day, I mean, first of all, the other part of the Red Cross is service to the armed forces. And that's the role that I'm in, and I'm dedicated to making sure that we take care of our troops and their families from a humanitarian perspective, and that we can respond to their emergencies through our Hero Care Center 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, anywhere around the globe. Because we have Red Crossers deployed all around the globe.
Fantastic. Dr. Jordan, thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave. My pleasure.
And stick around because coming up next, Jacqueline Stewart will be here with this week's edition of Silent Sunday Nights.